Something we tend to see across a lot of our research is the US being something of a powerhouse. When there is a new IT strategy or a new IT movement, it tends to not only come from the US, but it also tends to be US organizations that are more interested in it, that adopt it first and that pave the way for the rest of the world to then follow afterwards. There's certainly a hint of that in the research that we've done here. We've been talking about the UK results so far. We did ask very similar questions in the US to a very similar audience. And there is a slight difference between the two. What's particularly interesting, I thought, is the fact that 73% of those that we spoke to in the US said that BYOD potentially presents a competitive advantage to organisations. It's almost 3/4 are saying this gives us something that we wouldn't ordinarily have. Only 44% of those in the UK reported the same thing. So there's a real obvious difference where the respondents in the US say that this is potentially really good and does present us with something that the people in the UK don't necessarily get. That ties in with what we see across a lot of research in that it does show that the US is perhaps a little bit ahead. But the rest of the research doesn't necessarily show the same thing, because although, yes, people in the US might be a bit more on the ball and think that it does present them with all sorts of opportunities, they're not handling BYOD in necessarily the same way in the UK. Only 39% of those that we spoke to in the US say that they have a BYOD policy that actually allows employees to use their own devices for work purposes. 39% compared to 52% in the UK. So there is a difference in making sure that these organisations do have a policy, and the US is a little bit further back. And in fact, what's particularly interesting is that 30% of those that we spoke to in the US say that they have a BYOD policy that prohibits people from using their own devices. So although they do recognise that BYOD can present them with a competitive advantage, there's a little bit of worry here. 30%, almost 1 in 3, saying we're not really sure how to do this, and we need to actually protect our infrastructure, we need to protect our data, we're going to prohibit people using their own devices. Although they do potentially have prohibitions in place, that doesn't necessarily stop people. On another question, we saw that 92% of those people in the US that we spoke to were saying that employees are using their own devices for work purposes or their own applications for work purposes. 92%, and that's such a gulf from the 39% who have a BYOD policy that encourages and allows people to use their own devices for work purposes. It does suggest that almost half of those in the US are seeing people bring in their own devices who are using those devices for work purposes, but they don't have a formal policy in place outlining how those devices should be used in order to protect the data, to protect the infrastructure, to make sure that the organisation keeps running properly and keeps running smoothly. So although the US is perhaps ahead in terms of awareness and how BYOD could present them with a competitive advantage, in terms of actual implementation, they're perhaps a little bit behind the UK.